The woman walked in alone. That was the first thing the man at the back wall noticed, not the crowd, not the heat, not the smell of old pine and sweat, and August pressing through the windows. He noticed that Evelyn Carter walked through the door of her own auction without anyone beside her, and that the room did not part for her the way a room parts for someone it respects. It parted the way a room parts for someone it has decided is already finished. She made it to the third row and sat down. A man 2 seats over leaned to the man beside him and said something. Both of them looked at her. One of them smiled. Not kindly. She did not react. She folded her hands on her lap and looked straight ahead at the auctioneer's table, and whatever she was feeling in that moment, she had decided the room was not going to see it. Harold Pike was already in the front row. He had arrived early enough to choose his seat, and had chosen the one directly in front of the auctioneer's table, the position of a man who wanted to be seen conducting business, not merely attending it. He wore a dark suit that pulled slightly at the shoulders. He did not look at Evelyn. He had already looked at her ranch, already measured the fences, already told his foreman where to run the prod, new cattle line. Evelyn Carter was paperwork to him now. The auction was a formality. He had the patience of a man counting down the last few minutes of something that was already done. Walter Boone, the bank manager, was at the table near the auctioneer. He had spoken to the auctioneer before the room filled a brief, efficient exchange, the kind between two men, confirming that the machine is ready to run. When he sat down, he set his briefcase beside his chair with the care of a man protecting something valuable, and then he looked out at the room with the mild, professional satisfaction of someone watching a plan reach its conclusion. He did not look at Evelyn either. That was the thing about men like Boone. By the time the day arrived, they had already stopped seeing the person. They only saw the property. Dale Hensley came in with a clipboard and sat beside Pike, writing things on a notepad, with the distracted focus of a man who was trying very hard not to look like he was part of something, while being entirely part of it. The room filled the rest of the way with the people of Caldwell Flats. Some came out of genuine curiosity. Some came because they had heard there might be trouble and had decided trouble was worth seeing. A few came because they were the kind of people who have always gone to public executions and told themselves they were just watching. One woman in her 50s with a gray braid sat beside Evelyn, a neighbor. She had not said much. She was just there, which, in that room, on that morning, was an act of courage in its own small way. Earl Moss settled one seat down from Evelyn with the deliberate care of an old man who had decided his joints were not going to stop him from being present. In the back row, against the wall in the shadow between the last window and the corner, a man in a canvas travel jacket stood without announcing himself. His sunglasses were still on. His hands were quiet. He had been there before the doors opened, and he had watched every person come in, and he had not moved from his position and had not spoken to anyone. Nobody had spoken to him. Nobody had looked at him twice. The room was too focused on the woman in the third row, on watching her hold herself together in a space designed to take the last thing she had left. The auctioneer struck the table once with the gavel. The room went quiet so fast it seemed like the air itself pulled back. The proceedings for the formal sale of the Carter Ranch property, Lot 14, Caldwell County, are hereby commenced under the terms of the foreclosure instrument filed by First Consolidated Bank of Caldwell Flats on July the 9th, 1968. All bids are final. All transfers are immediate upon final bid acceptance and completion of payment. Terms. Any questions regarding the legal basis of this auction should be directed to the bank's legal representative, who is present and available. Nobody asked any questions. The ceiling fan clicked on every rotation. 3 days earlier, the man at the back wall had not known any of these people existed. The summer of 1968 had not been kind to the idea of silence, and Los Angeles had stopped offering it entirely. Steve McQueen packed one bag, left without telling the studio or his manager, and drove east before the city was awake. He drove because it was one of the few things that still gave the world edges. By the time he crossed into Texas, the radio had gone quiet and the land had opened into the kind of flat, honest country that didn't pretend to be anything else. He stopped for gas, stopped for coffee, and found himself at a diner in a town called Caldwell Flats. because the thermos had run out 40 miles back and the sign said open. The diner was called Marvine's, though the second E in the sign had burned out and nobody had replaced it. A bell above the door announced him. The woman behind the counter, who had the kind of face that had seen 50 years of other people's problems and learned to listen without leaning, looked up and said good morning without ceremony. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee and asked if there was anything left from breakfast. There were eggs and toast, she said. He said that would be fine. Her name tag said Ruth. 2 stools down, an old man in a plaid shirt and worn suspenders was nursing a coffee of his own, staring at nothing in particular on the far side of the room, the way old men do when they are replaying something in their heads for the 47th time and still haven't figured out what they should have said. From a booth near the window, 2 men in clean clothes that were too heavy for the heat were talking about real estate, not loudly, but not quietly enough. Ruth set the coffee in front of him without asking how he took it, which was the right decision because he took it black. She had made that red in the time it took him to sit down. He appreciated people who paid attention. He did not remove his sunglasses yet. He turned the mug slowly with one hand, not drinking, listening to the 2 men in the booth. They were talking about land values, about a property on the north edge of the county, about a widow who didn't understand her situation. One of them heavy through the place. Shoulders, string tie, the practiced calm of a man accustomed to transactions was explaining to the other that the bank had been extraordinarily patient. That 7 months was a generous extension. That sentiment did not change the terms of a promissory note. The other man said something about Evelyn Carter managing on her own. The first man shrugged the way you shrug about weather. She's not managing. She's just not gone yet. There's a difference. He picked up his coffee. Woman like that, no children, no family nearby, no money she's already lost. She just hasn't been told officially. He said it without cruelty. That was the worst part of it. He said it the way you say a fence needs replacing. Just a fact. Just a thing that was going to happen. The other man nodded with the enthusiasm of someone whose income depended on agreeing. Steve ate his eggs. Ruth refilled his coffee without being asked and moved back to the far end of the counter, where she began slicing a pie with the focused attention of someone who had decided that the booth conversation was not worth the cost of hearing it clearly. The old man 2 stools down shifted finally. He turned toward Steve just slightly, not looking at him directly, but adjusting his posture in a way that loosened something. Tom Carter never missed a payment in 22 years. He said it quietly, not to anyone specific, but to the air in front of him, the way a man says something he has been holding for too long and needs to put somewhere. Steve looked at him. The old man's name was Earl Moss, though Steve didn't know that yet. His hands were thick and permanently stained at the knuckles, the hands of a man who had worked ground his whole life and didn't pretend otherwise. Missed one, Earl continued, and it was because he was in the hospital with his chest and couldn't get to the phone to call. The moment he was out, he drove to that bank, himself, and paid double. I was with him. Watched him count the bills onto Boone's desk. Boone wrote it down. Said they were square. Steve said nothing. He waited. Now they say the account was in arrears going back 18 months. Earl shook his head. Slowly. 18 months. Tom's been dead 7. The man wasn't missing payments while he was alive. I'd stake my land on it. Ruth had stopped slicing the pie. She wasn't pretending to be busy anymore. You want more coffee, Earl? She asked. It was not really a question about coffee. I'm fine, Ruth. The 2 men in the booth were still talking. One of them laughed at something, a short sound like a door slamming in an empty house. Steve turned to look at the booth. The men did not notice. He turned back to his plate and finished the last piece of toast, chewing slowly, thinking. What happened to the account records? He asked. Earl looked at him for the first time. His eyes were pale blue and not particularly warm, but they were honest. He took a measure of the man beside him, the quiet jacket, the sunglasses now removed and laid on the counter, the hands that had worked things, the stillness that wasn't vacancy but something more deliberate. Bank says the original payment ledger was damaged in a pipe leak 2 winters back. Earl said. Replaced it with a reconstructed document. Their word against the widow's memory. And the widow, she has nothing? Tom kept his own books, but after he died, some men from the bank came out to the ranch. to take inventory of assets against the outstanding loan. Evelyn said afterward that the filing cabinet in Tom's office wasn't the way he left it, one folder gone. Steve set his coffee mug down. Ruth appeared at his end of the counter, ostensibly wiping the surface near him. Tom used to say the land knew something the rest of us didn't, she said, low enough that the booth couldn't hear. He said if anything happened to him, Evelyn needed to find the papers he kept separate from the business files. Said they were important, but he didn't want to make a fuss about it. Where did he keep them? Steve asked. That's what nobody knows, Ruth said. Evelyn's looked. She doesn't know what she's looking for exactly, or where Tom would have put something he considered separate. The bell above the door rang. A young man came in looking for a to-go order. Ruth went to get it. Earl finished his coffee and stood up slowly, the joints in his legs reluctant to agree to the project. Auctions in 3 days, he said. Friday morning, 9 o'clock. Town hall, he said it. 1. Without drama, just the fact. Then he put on his hat, settled it with a small press of the palm, and walked out. Steve sat at the counter for another 10 minutes. He watched the two men in the booth finish their conversation, leave bills on the table without looking at the amount, and walk out with the comfortable rhythm of men who were done with the unpleasant part of their morning and could now move on to the pleasant part. He asked Ruth for the check. She wrote it out and slid it across. Caldwell Flats is a small town, she said, quiet. People here are not bad people, mostly. But they've learned which way the wind blows, and they've learned to stand in the direction that keeps them dry. Except Earl, Steve said. Earl's too old to care about getting wet, she said. And he was at Tom's funeral, stood right at the grave, and told Evelyn that Tom died a good man, and that good men shouldn't be forgotten by their neighbors. Steve left a bill on the counter that covered the meal and whatever the woman's patience had been worth that morning, which he estimated was considerable. He put his sunglasses back on and walked out into the white heat of the Texas morning. He stood beside his car for a moment. The two men from the booth came out behind him and got into a clean late-model car with a Pike dealership plate on the front and drove north on the county road toward the Carter ranch, going to take another look at what they were about to own. He watched the car until it was a dust trail. He got in his car. He had come to Texas for silence. He had found instead the sound of a machine running, quiet, methodical, completely certain of itself, built to take something from a woman who had done nothing to deserve losing it, using the one instrument nobody in this town had the standing to challenge. He turned the key. He drove north, toward the Carter Ranch. The land approaching the Carter Ranch did not look like a dying operation. The fence lines had been mended with whatever was available at the time. The irrigation ran at angles that followed actual water behavior, not a surveyor's ideal. The cattle were sparse, Evelyn had sold most of the herd in the spring, but those remaining were not poorly kept. The 24 soil was dry the way all Texas soil was dry in August, but it was not cracked and exhausted. This was not a ranch that had been mismanaged. It had run out of time. Those were different things, and Steve noticed the difference the moment he turned off the road. He pulled up to the gate and stopped the car. The gate was closed, chained loosely, the kind of closure that said, "This is private and I'd prefer you knock," rather than "This is fortified and I mean to keep you out." He got out of the car and stood there for a moment, reading the sign nailed to the gatepost. Carter Ranch. Private property. Tom and Evelyn Carterest. 1,939. Tom's name was still there. The paint was weathered, but the letters were clean. Someone had touched them up recently, because the edges were sharper than the board beneath them. He heard the screen door of the farmhouse open before he heard footsteps, and then he heard footsteps on the porch and on the gravel path with the particular cadence of someone who knew where they were going and was not dawdling. Evelyn Carter came around the corner of the outer fence with a look on her face that was not hostile, but was absolutely prepared to be. She was wiping her hands on a cloth, not because they were wet, but because it gave her hands something to do, and she stopped, about 10 feet away, and looked at him with the calm directness of a woman who had been receiving strangers with insufficient news for 7 months and had learned to get to the point. "Can I help you? I heard about the auction," he said. "Thought I'd drive out. Take a look at the property." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not suspicion exactly. More like recalibration. You here on behalf of someone? No, just passing through. Stopped at the diner this morning. Ruth's, she said. Not a question. She already knew where strangers stopped in Caldwell. Flats. There was one option. Yes, ma'am. She looked at his car for a moment, then back at him. She was doing the same thing he did. In rooms, reading, measuring, deciding. You thinking about bidding? She asked. I'm thinking about understanding what I'd be bidding on, he said. A long pause. A hawk moved in a slow circle over the far pasture. The windmill near the pause. Barn turned with a sound like a playing card in a bicycle wheel, rhythmic, slightly, imperfect, reliable. The bank will tell you the property is worth a figure, Evelyn said. The figure they'll tell you is low, lower than it's worth. She said it without anger. The way you state a fact about weather, what would you say it's worth? I'd say that depends on what you're measuring, she said. If you're measuring grass and fencing and cattle capacity, there's a number for that. If you're measuring what it took to build it, there's a different number. She paused. If you're measuring what it means, there's no number at all. He looked at the land behind her, the farmhouse, the barn, the line of trees along the Proddy creek that Tom Carter had planted as windbreak 40 years ago because he believed in thinking ahead. Would you mind showing me around? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his manner that she was trying to place, not deference exactly, but a quality of attention that was different from the men who had been coming to her door since Tom died. Those men had looked at her ranch with a particular kind of eye, the eye of someone reading a price tag. This man was looking at the land itself. You got a name? She asked. Steve, he said. She did not ask for a last name. She tucked the cloth into her pocket. Come on then, she said. I'll show you what they're trying to take. They walked the property for the better part of an hour. Evelyn did not perform the tour. She did not try to sell him anything or convince him of anything. She simply walked the land. The way someone walks their own floor in the dark from memory, from familiarity, from the particular ownership of someone who has given a place years of their attention. She showed him the original section, the 30 acres that Tom's father had broken from rock and clay in 1939 with 2 mules and a borrowed plow. She showed him the east expansion that Tom had added in 1952 with a loan he paid back in 4 years, 2 years ahead of schedule. And she showed him the creek along the southern edge and the small retention system Tom had built to keep the water from running off too fast in spring. He read books about water, she said, not agriculture books, hydrology. He ordered them. Plussin, from a university catalog. They thought he was strange. She smiled very slightly. He knew what he was doing. Steve crouched at the edge of the creek and put his hand in the soil. Not wet, but not dry either. The kind of soil that held what it got. He stood up without saying anything. Near the barn, she paused. They sent a man out here 2 weeks ago, she said. Said he was from the bank, checking asset values. I was in town. My neighbor called to tell me a car was parked by my barn. When I got back, the man was gone. She looked at the barn door. The lock had been changed. Since. What was in the barn before the new lock? He asked. Tom's equipment. Some stored hay. An old calf pen. And she stopped. And? Some boxes from the office. I moved them out there after he died, she said. I didn't. I want to look at them yet. I wasn't ready. She was quiet for a moment. Now. I wish I'd gone through them sooner. Have you looked at them since? Some, she said. She opened the barn door. A smell of oil and hay and dry wood came out. Warm and close. Not unpleasant. The smell of a place that had been used well. There's a lot. Tom kept everything. Steve stepped into the barn and let his eyes adjust. Along the east wall, on a shelf of salvaged lumber, cardboard boxes, 2 wooden crates, a filing cabinet with a broken handle. On the floor, a coffee can of bolts. He looked at the boxes. Which boxes were already open when you looked? Evelyn pointed to 3 on the left. Neat handwriting on each Tom's office. Files 1,961, 65. Equipment warranties. Crop records. 1,955, 1,960. The others? He asked. I haven't touched the others. He looked at the crates. One was sealed with wire. The other had its lid sitting loosely, not closed, not open. The posture of something interrupted. When was the last time you were in here before the bankman came? 2 weeks before that, she said. I came to get a wrench. I didn't look at the boxes. And the lid on that crate, he said, pointing to the one with the displaced cover, was it like that before? Evelyn looked at it. A pause that was not long, but was complete. No, she said. I put that lid on tight. Tom always said keep the wood closed or the mice. Get in. Steve walked to the crate and looked inside without touching it. Old machinery manuals. A coiled piece of rope, some folded canvas, and at the bottom, slightly askew, as if it had been lifted and replaced without care, a bundle of papers tied with kitchen twine. Do you know what those are? He asked. Evelyn came to stand beside him and looked. No, she said. They look like they were moved, he said. Recently. She reached in and took the bundle out carefully. The twine was tied in a specific knot, not a bow, but the kind of knot a man uses when he wants to be sure the bundle stays together but can still be opened quickly. She held it for a moment without untying it. This is Tom's knot, she said, almost to herself. He tied everything this way. I used to tease him about it. Steve let the silence sit. Whatever that is, he said finally, I wouldn't open it alone. She looked at him. You're not just passing through, she said. It was not an accusation. It was the same steady recalibration she had made at the gate. She was a woman who did not miss things. Grief had put a film over her attention for 7 months, but underneath it, the instrument was still precise. He thought about the 2 men in the diner. The one who had said she's already lost. She just hasn't been told officially. He thought about Hensley with the survey tube. About Boone arriving at a bank that had been there longer than the Carters and would still be there after they were gone. About the way the room at the auction was going to feel tomorrow morning, packed with people who came to watch a conclusion they had already accepted. He thought about Tom Carter's knot, the way a man ties something when he intends for it, to still be there when he is not. No, he said, I don't think I am. He did not stay at the ranch that first afternoon. He drove back into Caldwell Flats and took a room at the only hotel in town, a 2-story building on the main street with a hand-painted sign and window units that worked when they felt like it. The man at the desk gave him a key and asked no questions. Steve paid 2 nights in advance and left the name he had been using the whole trip, his own first name, only, which in a town this size apparently meant nothing to anyone. That changed the following morning, but before it changed, he had one more evening of invisibility, and he used it. He walked the town. Not quickly. He stopped at the hardware store and listened to 2 men behind the counter talk about the auction, the way people talk about weather as something that happens to other people. He stopped at the barber shop and sat in the waiting chair, while the barber told a customer that Harold Pike was planning to run cattle on the Carter land by October. The customer said that was a shame. The barber said it was just business. Then the barber said something else. He said Pike had been in earlier that morning and had joked that the auction was the most expensive funeral Caldwell Flats had seen in years. The customer laughed. The barber laughed. Then the barber noticed Steve in the mirror, and the laughter stopped, because the man in the waiting chair was not laughing and had a quality of stillness that made a room realize what it had just done. Steve set the magazine down and walked out without a haircut. He walked past the bank, which was closed at that hour, and looked at the brass plate. Beside the door, First Consolidated Bank of Caldwell Flats, Walter Boone, manager. EST, 1931. The bank had been there longer than the Carters. That was the kind of fact that mattered in a small town. It meant the bank had outlasted other people's troubles. Before, it expected to outlast this one, too. The following morning, he drove out to the south edge of the county, where Dale Hensley's real estate office occupied a converted house on a gravel road. He didn't go in. He parked on the road and watched. Hensley arrived at 7:45, before the office opened, which meant he wasn't there for walk-in business. He was carrying a rolled tube of paper, the kind used for blueprints or survey maps, and he carried it with the slight awkwardness of a man who did not want to be seen carrying it, but had no better option. He went inside. 20 minutes later, Harold Pike's truck pulled into the gravel lot. Pike was a large man who moved like someone accustomed to physical space and expected other people to arrange themselves accordingly. He went inside without knocking. Steve drove away before anyone came back out. Later that day, he went back to the Carter ranch. Evelyn met him at the gate with slightly less wariness than the day before, which in her terms was a significant adjustment. He told her what he had heard at the diner, the reconstructed ledger, the missing folder, the teller who had left town. He asked if she still had any personal records of Tom's payments. Not the office files, which had been targeted, but something kept at home. Check stubs, a bank book, anything. She thought for a moment, then led him inside. The house was clean and quiet, with the particular stillness of a place where one person lived in a space built for two. The furniture was plain and good, the kind bought once and kept. On the mantel, a wedding photograph and a framed discharge document from Tom Carter's military service. Evelyn went to the bedroom and came back with a shoebox. It contained, among other things, a small spiral notebook, the pocket-sized kind sold at every drugstore in America, in which Tom Carter had kept his own running record of every payment he had made to the bank, going back 8 years, date, amount, check number, and the initials of whoever had received the payment at the teller's window. Steve sat at the kitchen table and went through it. The entries were meticulous, every payment on time or early, every amount matching the prov. Agreed installment schedule with occasional additional principal payments written in a different ink, noted separately. The last entry was dated 4 months before Tom died, for a double payment, with a note beside it. TW received confirmed square through Q3, 2/12. He looked at the notebook for a long time. "Do you know who TW was?" he asked. Evelyn came to look. "Tom always dealt with a teller named Turner Wyatt," she said. "He worked at the bank for years." She paused. "He moved away. Left town about a year before. Tom died. Do you know where he went?" "I don't. Lubbock, maybe." Someone said Lubbock. Steve set the notebook down carefully. Outside the window, a car slowed on the road that ran past the ranch property. It did not stop, but it slowed enough to be deliberate. Through the window, Steve could see the distinct shape of Dale Hensley's green Chevrolet. Evelyn had seen it too. She said nothing. She had learned not to react to these things. Because reacting gave them power she was not willing to give. "This happens?" he asked. 3 or 4 times a day," she said. "Sometimes it's Hensley. Sometimes it's one of Pike's hands. Once it was someone I didn't recognize at all." "And the sheriff?" "Lou Braddock," she said, and the way she said the name was its own full answer. Lou. Braddock had been in office 11 years, and understood that the way you stayed in office, in a county like this, was to know which problems to take seriously, and which problems to let resolve themselves. The foreclosure of a widow's ranch was the latter category. Steve looked at the shoebox, at the notebook, at the wedding photo on the mantel. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "There's a payphone at the gas station on Elm," she said. He drove to the gas station on Elm, fed coins into the payphone, and called a lawyer in. Dallas, who had done work for him twice before, the kind of man who could find the loose thread in a legal document in the time it took most people to find the right page. The lawyer's name was Mitchell Hale. He answered on the 3rd ring. Steve explained the situation in 6 sentences. Hale asked 4 precise questions. Steve answered them. "Fax me whatever documents she has," Hale said. "Everything. And get me the name of that. Tell her. If he exists and can be found, he's your best witness." "I know where to start," Steve said. He hung up and drove back toward town, and that was when the first part of his invisibility ended. He pulled into the garage near the center of town to ask about a slight sound the engine had been making since Oklahoma, a minor issue, not urgent, but the kind of thing he did not let sit. A young mechanic named Bobby Crane crawled out from under a Ford and looked up at him with a wrench in his hand and stopped. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at Steve the way people look at something they are trying to confirm against an internal image. Then, with great restraint, he said, "You're Steve McQueen." "Yes," Steve said. Bobby Crane let out a breath and looked at the wrench in his hand like he was deciding whether it was an appropriate thing to be holding in this situation. "What can I help you with?" he managed. By the time Steve left the garage 45 minutes later, with a minor adjustment made, and a conversation that had turned, naturally and without Steve pushing it, to the subject of the town and the Carter Ranch, and what most people privately thought about the whole business, he knew that his quiet stay in Caldwell Flats had officially ended. Bobby Crane told his cousin. His cousin told the woman at the post office. The woman at the post office told 4 people before noon. By afternoon, the town knew. It changed the air. Caldwell Flats had a clear understanding of its own order. The bank at the top, working, people in the middle, and at the bottom, the ones who had fallen behind, which was where Evelyn Carter had been for 7 months, and which everyone had accepted as a permanent condition. Steve McQueen had no place in that order. That was the disorienting part. He was not richer than Harold Pike by any local measure, but he was something the town's hierarchy had no category for, and a system without a category for something was briefly, dangerously, uncertain about what to do next. Harold Pike sent a man to the hotel that afternoon. The man knocked on Steve's door and explained politely that Mr. Pike would be honored if Mr. McQueen would join him for dinner that evening at the ranch, and that Mr. Pike had always admired Mr. McQueen's work and hoped they might have a chance to speak personally about the region and its opportunities. Steve told the man to thank Mr. Pike and that he already had plans. The man nodded and left. But before he did, he mentioned almost as an afterthought something Pike had apparently said on the way over, that Mr. Pike wanted Mr. McQueen to know that the Carter woman was a nice enough lady, but some people just weren't built to hold on to things. That there was no shame in it, that the land would be in better hands. Steve looked at the man for a moment. The man seemed to understand, in the way that messengers sometimes understand, that he had delivered the wrong message to the wrong person. He left quickly. Steve stood at the window. Some people just weren't built to hold on to things. He had spent the last 2 days watching a woman who had worked the same ground for 29 years, who had kept her husband's records with precision, who had driven herself to the auction of her own ranch without flinching, and Harold Pike's considered opinion was that she wasn't built to hold on to things. He picked up his jacket from the chair. An hour later, Walter Boone appeared at the hotel himself, which was unusual enough that the desk clerk looked up and watched the whole interaction. Boone was in his best suit, and carried with him the particular quality of false warmth that men adopt when they have suddenly recognized a risk and need to neutralize it socially before it becomes something else. He introduced himself, explained his role at the bank, and said he hoped Steve was finding Caldwell Flats comfortable. Then, almost as an aside, in the casual register of a man trying to make something ugly sound routine, he mentioned that the Carter situation was genuinely unfortunate, that the bank had offered Mrs. Carter several opportunities to resolve the matter before it reached this point, that the institution had no interest in anything other than recovering what it was owed. He said all of this with the practiced sympathy of a man who had given this speech before and knew the words that kept people from asking the next question. Steve looked at him for a moment. "How many times did you extend the deadline?" he asked. Boone blinked. "I beg your pardon? You said you gave her opportunities. How many extensions did the bank offer before filing the foreclosure instrument?" A pause. The practiced sympathy recalibrated into something more careful. "The account history is confidential, Mr. McQueen. I'm sure you understand." "How long has the account been in arrears?" 18 months, Boone said, and then heard himself say it, and the calculation in his eyes adjusted slightly, as though he had just handed something to the wrong person. "The husband died 7 months ago," Steve said. "So the account went into arrears 11 months while the man was still alive." He looked at Boone. "You ever meet Tom Carter?" "On several occasions. People who knew him say he was meticulous about payments. People who knew him personally would say that, and people who worked with him at your bank would say something different. The bank's records are the bank's records, Mr. McQueen. Do you have the original payment ledger?" The pause was brief, barely visible, but Steve had spent enough years reading people under pressure to see it. The original was damaged in a pipe leak. Steve nodded once. "And the reconstructed document? Who reconstructed it?" "Our accounting department, under standard procedure." Steve picked up his sunglasses from the side table and put them on slowly. He did not say anything else. He simply waited. in the same, still, unhurried way that made rooms uncomfortable until the silence became the message. Boone said it was a pleasure and that he hoped Steve enjoyed the rest of his time in town. He left. Steve sat on the edge of the bed and listened to Boone's footsteps on the stairs, then the door, then the quiet again. The reconstructed document, produced by the very institution that stood to gain from the foreclosure, no original to compare against, a pipe leak that couldn't be verified. The teller who had received Tom Carter's last confirmed payment, gone. That was not a legal standing. That was a blueprint. He drove back to the diner that evening. Ruth was at the counter. Earl Moss was gone, home by 4, as was his habit. But Ruth knew things, and when she decided to share them, she shared them without ceremony. He asked about Turner Wyatt. She wiped the counter and thought. Turner left in the fall of '66, she said. Had some kind of disagreement with Boone. About procedure. She said it carefully. The way you say things when you suspect what you know might matter to someone. He went to his sister's place. She's in Abilene, I believe. Last I heard, he was working at a savings and loan there. You have a name for the sister? Pearl Wyatt. Didn't change her name. Never married. He used the payphone outside the diner. Information in Abilene. One Pearl Wyatt on. Listing. He wrote the number on the back of a gas receipt. He drove back to the hotel. The neon sign of the barber shop was still on past closing time. The main street was empty in the way small towns go empty late completely, without apology. He had one day. Tomorrow he would find Turner Wyatt. Friday was the auction. He drove out to the Carter ranch the next morning early. Evelyn was already up on the Carter porch with coffee, sitting in one of 2 chairs that faced the land. When his car came up the road, she watched it the whole way without standing, which was a kind of acknowledgement. He got out and she handed him the second cup without asking if he wanted it, which meant she had been expecting him. He sat in the second chair. For a moment neither of them said anything, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but the more valuable kind, the silence where 2 people are thinking about the same thing, from different angles, and both know it. Tom used to sit here every morning, she said, before anything started. He said the land told you what it was going to be like that day if you sat still long enough to listen. Did he believe that literally? Somewhere between literally and poetically, she said. Tom was not a poetic man by nature, but he became one, I think. The land does that. She drank her coffee. He knew something was wrong 6 months before he died, she said. Not with his heart. With the bank. He started keeping things separate. The little notebook you found. Other things. He said he didn't want to worry me, but he also said he wanted to make sure there was a record somewhere that didn't live at the bank or in the office cabinet. The bundle in the barn, Steve said. He showed it to me once, she said. Said it was insurance. I didn't ask what kind. I should have asked. She held her mug in both hands, not drinking. That's the thing about the people we trust the most. We sometimes forget to ask them the important questions, because we're so sure they'll always be there to answer. What did he think the bank was going to do? He thought they were going to find a way to accelerate the debt when land values in the problem area changed. She looked at the horizon. Tom read everything. Newspapers. Agricultural. 200. Agricultural. Reports. Planning documents from the county. He knew that there was a survey being done of the water table in this area, and that there were preliminary discussions about a state road expansion through the eastern part of the county. He said that if those 2 things came together, this land would be worth 3 times what anyone in town thought, maybe more. And he thought the bank knew that? He thought someone in a position to know told someone at the bank, she said. Not Boone. Necessarily. Boone is small. Someone above him, a director, someone with connections to the county planning office. He thought there was a reason the bank had been patient about minor delays for years, and then suddenly became very precise about the exact terms of the note. She paused. Very precise. Starting about 2 years ago. Steve looked at the land. The bundle, he said. Did you look at it? Last night, she said. After you left. She stood and went inside. She came back with the bundle, still tied with Tom's knot, but the knot was loose now, opened and retied. She set it on the small table between the 2 chairs. There's a letter from a surveying company in Houston, she said, dated October of '66. Tom never opened it. She said that quietly, with the specific grief of a detail that landed differently in retrospect. He must have received it just before he got sick the first time, when he was in the hospital, and then when he came out, other things took priority. She paused. It's addressed to him. I read it. What does it say? It says that preliminary hydrological assessment of Caldwell County grid sections 14 through 19 indicates significant subsurface water retention capacity and possible artesian aquifer access. It says that the landowners in those sections are encouraged to contact the company for formal assessment. It says the study was commissioned by the Texas State Highway Department in connection with planning for future regional development. She said this with the careful precision of someone who had read the words many times and was now holding them at arm's length to make sure she wasn't adding anything to them. Grid Section 14, Steve said. That's this property, she said. What are sections 15 through 19? 3 are fallow parcels owned by a county land trust. 1 is Earl Moss's lower field. 1 is she stopped. What? Harold Pike's eastern pasture. Steve set his coffee mug down on the porch rail. It was not complicated. Once you knew what to look for, someone had seen this survey, possibly through the bank, possibly through the county planning office, possibly through a connection that would take months to trace. They had seen it and understood what it meant, that a specific corridor of Caldwell County land, including the Carter Ranch, sat on top of something valuable, not gold, not oil, water and road access, which in West Texas, in 1968, with development money beginning to move through the region, was worth more than either, and someone had decided to own it before anyone else knew to want it. The method was simple. You do not buy the land outright from a rancher who does not want to sell. You wait. You apply pressure slowly through the institution you control. You recalibrate a debt. You let interest build. You allow a man with a bad heart to work himself into the ground trying to stay current on a note that has been quietly adjusted against him. And when he dies, you move quickly, before the widow has time to understand what is happening or find anyone who will help her. You count on the fact that a grieving woman in a small Texas county has no lawyer, no political allies, no money to fight, and no one willing to stand beside her. They had not counted on Tom's knot. They had not counted on a man stopping for coffee. Steve looked at the letter again. October 1966, a year and a half before Tom died. Almost 2 full years before the auction that was now 1 day away. We need to make some copies of this, he said. And the notebook. And anything else in that bundle. The copy machine at the library, she said. It costs a dime a page. That's fine. Steve. She said his name for the first time, and she said it the way people say a name. When they want to be sure the person is fully present. The auction is tomorrow. I know. Even if you can prove what Tom believed, that takes time. Courts take time. Lawyers take time. Tomorrow is tomorrow. I know that too, he said. He picked up the bundle. Can I borrow this for today? She nodded. Bring it back, she said. It's the last thing he touched that nobody else did. He drove into town, made copies at the library, and called Mitchell Hale from the pay phone on Elm. Hale read the relevant parts and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that letter alone changes the foreclosure's standing significantly. The 2022 question is whether we can establish that the bank had knowledge of it. That requires the teller. I'm working on that, Steve said. You have 1 day. I know. He hung up and dialed the number for Pearl Wyatt in Abilene. The phone rang 8 times. No answer. He drove back toward the ranch to return the papers to Evelyn. On the way, he passed Harold Pike's truck coming from the direction of the bank, moving fast, throwing a trail of dust on the county road. The man in the passenger seat of Pike's truck was Dale Hensley. They did not look at Steve as they passed. But Steve saw the rolled survey tube in the back of the truck. News in a small town does not travel fast or slow. It travels completely. By Thursday evening, Caldwell Flats had sorted itself into roughly 3 positions. The men connected to Pike and Boone were certain. The auction was legal, the debt was documented, and a movie star from California had no standing here regardless of his name. Some of them said this at normal volume in public places because they wanted it heard. The majority ordinary people who had lived beside the Carters long enough to have feelings about it were divided. Some thought it was a shame. Some thought Evelyn had been unlucky. A few thought something smelled wrong but couldn't say what. And a small number had quietly begun to wonder whether a man with no reason to stay had found, after all, a reason. The third position was Earl Moss and Ruth Danvers, and 3 or 4 others who had never believed the bank's version and were glad, in a private way, that the room had shifted. On Thursday evening, Steve drove back to the ranch one more time. He had tried Pearl Wyatt's number 6 more times. No answer. He had called a contact in Dallas who knew people in Abilene who might be able to reach Turner Wyatt through indirect routes. He had given that contact the name, the bank, and the time frame. The contact said he would try. He sounded uncertain about the timeline. Steve arrived at the Carter ranch at dusk. Evelyn was in the barn, the boxes down around her, going through them with the kind of concentrated purpose that grief sometimes converts into in its later stages, not preserving everything out of loyalty, but examining what was real and what needed to be kept. She had found something. She was standing at the shelf with a single folded paper in her hands when he came in. "I went through the rest of the boxes," she said, without turning around. She sounded calm. Not the brittle calm of suppressed emotion, but the real calm of someone who has arrived at a fact and is now deciding how to hold it. She turned and handed him the paper. It was a receipt. Carbon copy. The kind produced by a 2-part form, dated the 14th of April, 1967. The handwriting was careful and specific. Payment received in full for Q1 installment on note C147B in the amount of $840. Account standing, current. The signature at the bottom was T. Wyatt. The receipt was dated 14 months before the foreclosure filing. If the bank's reconstructed ledger showed the account in arrears 18 months back, and this receipt showed the account current 14 months back, the reconstruction was not inaccurate. It was fabricated. Steve held the receipt for a long time. "Tom kept a copy," she said. "He always kept the carbon. He said a receipt only meant something if both sides had it. Do you have others?" 7 more, she said, all with Turner Wyatt's signature, all from within the period the bank says the account was delinquent. She had them laid out on the shelf, not dramatically, not for presentation, but with the careful order of a woman who had learned from her husband to keep records as if they mattered, because they did. Steve looked at each one. Then he said, "I need these originals safe. Not here tonight." "Where?" "Earl Moss," he said. "Or someone who is not connected to any of this and has no reason to be targeted." "Earl," she said. "He was Tom's oldest friend. He would keep them in the ground if I asked." "Good. Take them to him tonight, before anyone else comes up this road." She looked at him. "Steve, even with these, the auction is in the morning." "I know. They won't stop it for a receipt. They'll say the receipt doesn't change the legal standing of the foreclosure instrument. They'll say it needs to go through a review process." She said this without anger. She had been told versions of these sentences by the bank's attorney twice in the last month. "It takes months," she said. "The auction is ours." He looked at her. "The auction will happen," he said. "I can't stop it." A pause. "But I can be in it." She looked at him for a long moment. In the amber light of the barn, with the smell of old wood and hay and oil around them, she was not a woman to be pitied. She was a woman, in the middle of a fight that no one had told her she had the right to fight, doing the fighting anyway. "Why?" she said, and it was not a theatrical question. It was a genuine one. She had earned the right to ask it. He thought for a moment, not about how to answer it eloquently, about how to answer it honestly. "Because I've spent enough time in rooms with powerful men to know exactly what they look like when they're taking something from someone who doesn't have anyone to stop them." He was quiet. "And I've never once seen one of those men who turned out to deserve what they took." She held his gaze for a moment. "Tom would have liked you," she said. She did not say it as a compliment exactly. She said it as a fact. "The way you state something you know is true and cannot prove." "He sounds like a man worth liking," Steve said. She took the receipts from the shelf and put them carefully in the pocket of her work coat. "I'll take them to Earl," she said. He drove back to town. The bank building was dark. He sat in the car outside the hotel. For a moment, looking at it, the auction was 9 hours away. He went inside, undressed, and lay on the bed in the dark room. At 11:42, the phone on the nightstand rang. It was his Dallas contact. He had found Turner Wyatt. Turner Wyatt was 51 years old, working as a loan processor at a small savings loan in Abilene. He had left Caldwell Flats in November of 1966 following a disagreement with Walter Boone about documentation procedures, specifically Boone's instruction that certain payment records be transferred to a new system without the originals being retained. Turner Wyatt had refused. 2 weeks later, his position was eliminated for budgetary reasons. He had not spoken publicly about First Consolidated Bank of Caldwell Flats in 2 years. But he answered when Steve's contact called, because Turner Wyatt was a man who knew what he had seen and knew it had not gone away simply because he had. He was on the phone with Steve at midnight. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Turner Wyatt remembered Tom Carter. He remembered the payments. He remembered with specific clarity the double payment in March of 1967, $840, counted out, in personal checks and one certified bank draft, received, logged, confirmed. He remembered writing TW at the bottom of the carbon. The account was current through the third quarter of 1,967 when he left the bank. He also remembered that in the week before he was let go, Walter Boone had asked him to certify a balance document that showed the Carter account in arrears as of July 1,967. Turner Wyatt had told Boone that the document was wrong. Boone had told him it reflected a recalculation of interest under a revised lending formula applied retroactively to older accounts. Turner Wyatt had said he would need to see the authorization for the retroactive application. He never received it. His position was eliminated before any authorization could be produced or withheld. Steve asked him if he would be willing to speak to a lawyer. Turner Wyatt said he had been waiting for someone to ask him that for 2 years. Steve called Mitchell Hale at 12:30 in the morning. Hale answered without complaint, which was why Steve paid him what he paid him. "Can you be in Caldwell Flats by 9?" Steve asked. A pause. "It's a 4-hour drive," Hale said. "I know." Another pause, briefer. "Yes," Hale said. Steve told him what he had. The receipts, now at Earl Moss's house. The letter from the Houston Surveying Company. The pocket notebook. Turner Wyatt's testimony. The telephone conversation, which Hale would need to follow up in person. The fraudulent reconstruction of the ledger, now clearly contradicted by physical documents still in existence. "This doesn't stop the auction," Hale said. "No," Steve said. "The auction proceeds under the foreclosure instrument. We can challenge the instrument. After, we can move for a stay." But in the morning he paused, thinking, "We'd need a judge willing to issue a temporary injunction before 9 a.m. on a Friday in a county where the judge has been letting this proceed for 7 months without interference." "Judge Raymond Altus," Steve said. "You know him?" "I know of him. People say he's cautious." "Cautious men don't issue emergency injunctions at dawn." "No," Steve said. "So the auction happens. Most likely. And I'll be in the room." A silence. "Steve," Hale said carefully, "what you spend at that auction to buy time for her, the bank will argue that you're not a valid party, that she had no authorized representative, that the bid should be void. It's not clean. But it creates a dispute," Steve said. "Yes. And a dispute buys time." "Yes. And time means Turner Wyatt can give his statement, and you can file the challenge, and the judge has actual documented evidence in front of him rather than a widow's word against a bank's reconstructed ledger." "Yes," Hale said. "That's the theory." "Drive carefully," Steve said. He hung up. He did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the window until the sky began to change. The contact, darkness thinning from the east. The flat land of Caldwell County did not look different in the dark than it did in the light. It was just harder to see what it was worth. At 5:30, someone knocked on his door. He opened it. It was Bobby Crane, the young mechanic, in clean clothes, and with the look of a man who had been awake for a while. "I know it's early," Bobby said. "It's fine. I heard you're going to be at the auction." That's the plan. Bobby held out a folded piece of paper. 3 of us put this together last night. Me, my cousin Dale, and a man named Fletcher who runs the grain elevator. He paused. It's a petition, asking Judge Altus to look into the bank's documentation before the auction proceeds. We got 14 signatures. We know it's not enough to stop anything, but we thought if you had it, if you brought it into the room, it would show that there are people here who didn't just go along with this. Steve took the paper and unfolded it. 14 names, written in different hands, some neat, some barely legible, some with addresses, some with just a name and a phone number. He looked at the list for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Bobby nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and wasn't sure if the moment would hold it. Then he said, "Tom Carter fixed my father's truck for free one winter when we couldn't afford it. Told him to pay him back when things got better. They never really did get better, and Tom never asked for it." He nodded once. "Morning, Mr. McQueen." He turned and walked back down the stairs. Steve folded the petition and put it in his jacket pocket. He dressed, washed his face, and drove to the town hall before 8 o'clock. He parked around the side and sat in the car with the windows down. The morning was still, cool, the heat not yet committed. Down the block, the bank was opening its doors. He watched Walter Boone arrive, look at the gathering crowd in front of the town hall, and straighten his tie. Across the street, he saw Evelyn Carter's truck pull in. She got out alone, as she had planned, as she had accepted. She stood beside her truck for a moment, looking at the building where the auction would take place. And then she walked toward it with the same quiet determination she had walked every morning of the last 7 months. Steve got out of his car. He put on his sunglasses and walked toward the town hall. He had a petition in his left pocket, and in his right coat pocket, folded small, he had a personal certified check for an amount that would have surprised most of the people in that building. The room filled quickly. By 8:50, there was standing room only. Auctions like this were normally procedural, events brief, technical, attended by the parties and a few witnesses. But Caldwell Flats had been building toward this morning for 3 days, and what should have been a formality had become something the town felt compelled to attend in person, the way people attend. Things they know they will need to remember. Harold Pike was in the front row, dark suit, slightly tight across the shoulders, the jacket of a man who has worn it for important occasions and has accumulated enough important occasions for it to have pulled at the seams. He sat with the settled ease of someone who has already stopped thinking about a decision and moved on to the details of its execution. Beside him, Hensley with the clipboard. Walter Boone was at the table beside the auctioneer. He had arrived before anyone, and he sat with the stillness of a man who has arranged everything carefully and does not intend to be surprised. On the table in front of him, a neat stack of documents. The bank's case. The reconstructed ledger. 7 months of architecture. Evelyn sat in the third row. Same dark blue dress, same folded hands. But something was different this morning. The woman with the gray braid was beside her again, and on her other side, Earl Moss had settled in with the slow, deliberate dignity of a man who had decided that his 71-year-old joints were not going to prevent him from being exactly where he needed to be. It was small, but it was something. Steve took his position at the back wall. The auctioneer called the room to order. The legal recitation began: property description, recorded liens, foreclosure instrument date, terms of sale. It moved with the rhythm of something recited so often it had lost meaning. Most of the room was not listening. They were watching the people. The opening figure was announced. Low, significantly below any comparable sale in the county, a number calibrated to sound like reasonable debt recovery while allowing the land to change hands at a fraction of what the people in that room, if they had read the right documents, would have understood it to be worth. Harold Pike made the first bid without looking up from the floor. The choreography was clean. A second bid from a man near the side wall, one of Pike's associates barely above the opener. Then Pike again, slightly higher. Back and forth. Contained, controlled. The mechanical rhythm of men executing a plan that had no opposition, taking turns raising the price by just enough to satisfy the legal requirement of a competitive auction while never threatening the ceiling they had agreed on in advance. The auctioneer moved through each bid with professional smoothness. Evelyn sat very still. Earl Moss's hands were flat on his knees. Then the auctioneer called for further offers. The room waited. Steve McQueen straightened from the back wall. He raised his hand once and named a number that ended the auction in a single move. Not a step above Pike's last bid, not a negotiating increment, not a challenge inviting further play. A figure so far above the arranged ceiling that the entire architecture of what Pike and Boone had built the patient months, the fabricated ledger, the quiet, conversations about fences and cattle lines and what to do with the north pasture simply stopped making sense. The room went so quiet you could hear the ceiling fan click. Harold Pike turned in his seat. His expression moved through 3 distinct stages in about 4 seconds. First, disbelief, because this was not supposed to happen. Second, calculation, because he was a man who calculated before he did anything else. Third, something close to fury, because the calculation told him that following this bid would cost him more than the land was worth even at its true value, that the figure on the table was not a bid in the way he understood bids. It was a wall. He looked at Boone. Boone had both hands flat on the table and was not looking at anyone. He was staring at the space in front of him with the expression of a man watching a building come apart from the inside. He had spent months constructing something that was, from where he sat, the only version of events that existed. A clean, documented, legally sound foreclosure on a property with an outstanding debt and a widow who had no resources to contest it. He had done everything correctly. He had been careful. He had not been careful enough. Hensley leaned to Pike and said something. Pike did not respond. The auctioneer asked for further bids. Silence. He asked again, as the procedure required. The room waited. Pike turned to look at the back wall one more time, at the man who had said nothing for 3 days, and then, with one number, made 7 months of planning irrelevant. The man who was not bidding against him out of greed or competition or desire for the land. The man who was bidding against him because he had decided that was the right thing to do, and had backed that decision with the only language that the room understood. Pike said nothing. He turned back to the front. The gavel came down. The sound it made in that room, in the silence that had gathered in the last 30 seconds, was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the sound of a conclusion, not the one the bank had planned, not the one the county had expected, but a conclusion nonetheless, clean and irreversible and final. Evelyn Carter closed her eyes. Not in relief exactly, in something harder to name the specific sensation of a person who has been bracing for an impact for so long that when it does not come, the body does not immediately believe it. 7 months of wait. 7 months of watching everything she and Tom had built get priced and processed and prepared for transfer. 7 months of folding her hands and keeping her voice steady in rooms where everyone had already decided how the story ended. The story had not ended that way. She opened her eyes. She looked straight ahead at the auctioneer's table. She did not look around the room. She did not look for anyone's reaction. She simply breathed, quietly. The way you breathe when you are reminding yourself that you are still here. Earl Moss exhaled. A slow, old man breath that had been held a long time. The woman with the gray braid reached over and put her hand on top of Evelyn's folded ones. Evelyn did not pull away. She looked down at the hand on hers for a moment, then back up, at the room, and for the first time that morning, something in her face was not controlled. It was simply real. The expression of a woman who has survived something that was not supposed to be survivable and is now deciding how to carry that. Harold Pike stood up. He stood the way large men stand when they are angry and have decided not to show it. Very straight, very deliberate, taking up exactly the amount of space he intended to take up, and not 1 inch less. He did not look at the auctioneer. He looked across the full length of the room at Steve, and the look was the look of a man who has been beaten in public by someone he had not taken seriously, and who is storing that fact somewhere cold and private for later. "This isn't done," he said, quietly, clearly, the words of a man who means them. Steve said nothing. He was already walking toward the front. Hensley, beside Pike, had closed his clipboard. He was not writing anything. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man rapidly reassessing his associations. Boone was on his feet, speaking in a rapid murmur to the bank's attorney. The attorney was writing, but the writing had the quality of a man documenting damage rather than building a case. Boone's composure, which had been his most reliable professional instrument, the thing that had carried him through 7 months of a plan he had believed was airtight, had developed a visible fracture. Not collapse. Not yet. But the thing behind the composure was showing through now, in the slightly too fast movement of his hands, the way his eyes were moving between the attorney, the auctioneer, and the check that Steve had set down. On the table, he was managing, but anyone watching could see that the managing had started. The room itself was shifting not loudly, not all at once, but in the way that rooms shift when something that was settled has come unsettled. The men who had come to witness a concluded transaction were whispering. Some of them were looking at Boone. Some were looking at Pike. A few were looking at Evelyn. This time, when they looked at Evelyn, the quality of the look was different. Steve reached the auctioneer's table and set the certified check down. The auctioneer looked at it, looked at Steve, looked at Boone, with the uncertain expression of a man who has just realized the room he is in is not the room he was hired to manage. Before the attorney could open his prepared objection, Steve turned to face the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not use more words than he needed. This payment satisfies the auction instrument under the terms announced this morning. He paused. I am not acquiring this property for myself. I am acting on behalf of Mrs. Evelyn Carter to protect her right of first refusal, which was not included in the bank's foreclosure filing and should have been. He looked directly at Boone. If the bank's counsel wants to dispute that, I'd suggest they take it up with Judge Altus today, because he is going to have questions for First Consolidated this afternoon regardless about the reconstructed ledger, about the payment receipts signed by your former teller Turner Wyatt that directly contradicted, and about the retroactive interest recalculation that Mr. Wyatt refused to certify before you eliminated his position. The attorney stopped writing. Boone looked at Steve. The fracture in his composure opened a little wider. Steve continued, Mrs. Carter has documentation going back 8 years showing every payment made on this account. Receipts with Turner Wyatt's signature, dated inside the period your ledger claims. The account was delinquent. She also has an unopened letter from a Houston surveying company addressed to her husband, received through this bank in October of 1966, identifying this property as part of a high-value development corridor. He paused one beat. That letter never reached him. The room had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that happens not when people have nothing to say, but when they are deciding all at once whether they are going to say it. Walter Boone, a man near the middle of the room, said. He said it like a statement, not an accusation, just a name, placed carefully in the air where everyone could look at it. It was Earl Moss, 71 years old, sitting beside Evelyn Carter, his hands still flat on his knees. I was with Tom Carter the morning he paid that bank double. I watched him count the money onto the desk. I told people that for 7 months. He looked at Boone across the room. Nobody with any authority listened. A single person in the back began to clap, then another. Not many, not an ovation, but real the sound of a few people in a room deciding to be counted. Walter Boone sat down. Mitchell Hale, who had been positioned near the side door since before the auction started, moved forward into the room. The formal proceedings that followed were not fast. Real justice rarely is. Mitchell Hale filed for a temporary restraining order that same afternoon. Judge Raymond Altus, cautious as advertised, read the filing twice, called Turner Wyatt that evening, and spoke with him for 35 minutes. He reviewed the payment receipts. Each one bore Turner Wyatt's initials and the account number of the Carter note. Monday morning, he issued the restraining order. Ownership of the property was frozen pending review. Evelyn Carter would not be required to vacate her home. The bank had 2 weeks to produce the original ledger supporting its reconstruction. They could not produce it. The pipe leak could not be verified. No insurance claim. No maintenance record. Nothing in the county assessor's office. The reconstruction had no source document. Its author, when deposed, was a junior clerk who had been handed a present spreadsheet of figures by Walter Boone and asked to format them into something official looking. He had not understood what he was participating in. He said so clearly. Walter Boone's deposition was on a Wednesday. By Friday, the bank's parent holding company had placed him on administrative leave. The phrasing was careful. The meaning was not. Harold Pike's attorney filed a motion withdrawing his client from the proceedings entirely, citing his position as a non-party. The motion acknowledged no wrongdoing. It was the exit of a man who knows when a room is no longer safe. Dale Hensley left town for a family matter and did not return. The hydrology survey was independently verified. A state official confirmed the relevant grid sections were part of an active infrastructure study and that the land was worth significantly more than county assessments reflected. How that information had reached the bank's decision-making would require further investigation. That investigation was ongoing. An independent audit of the Carter account concluded what Tom Carter's notebook had always shown. The account was not in arrears. The outstanding balance, correctly calculated, was manageable. A renegotiated plan was not only feasible, it was obvious. The bank's new acting manager called Evelyn's lawyer and proposed a restructured arrangement. The foreclosure was withdrawn. The title returned to Evelyn Carter's name. She signed the documents on a Tuesday afternoon. Mitchell Hale was beside her. When it was done, she sat for a moment with the papers in her hands. "It's yours, Mrs. Carter," Hale said. "It was always yours. Now it says so correctly." She folded them into her bag the way you fold something irreplaceable, which they were. Earl Moss was waiting outside in his truck with a thermos of coffee because he understood that important days required practical gestures. Ruth Danvers heard the news that evening, locked the diner early, and called 3 people. She did not need to be heard saying she was right, though she had been. She went home and sat in her kitchen with a feeling that was very close to peace. The story moved through Caldwell Flats the way real things move, changed slightly in the telling, but retaining at its center the thing that mattered. The woman had kept her land. The bank had been exposed. And the man who had stood at the back of that room had done something nobody asked him to do that had mattered more than anything anyone with official authority had managed in 7 months. Steve McQueen had left town the day after the auction. He had not waited for the resolution. He stopped at the Carter ranch before he left. It was early morning when he came. Evelyn had seen the car coming up the road from the porch, and she had gone inside and made coffee, not because she was sure he was coming in, but because it was the thing you did when someone you trusted appeared on your road in the early light. He came to the porch steps and stopped there. "Coming in?" she said. "Just for a minute," he said. He sat in the second chair. She handed him the coffee and sat in hers. The land was still, the way land is at that hour, not asleep, but quiet in the way of something gathering itself before the day begins. The windmill near the barn turned, with its soft clicking sound. The creek was audible from here if you listened for it, which was something Tom Carter had told her when they first came to the property. You can always hear the water if you stop making noise long enough. She had stopped making noise. She could hear it. "Your lawyer seems capable," she said. "He is. He explained the rest of it to me. What happens next with the bank, with the review?" She paused. "He said it'll take time." "Yes. He said the land value findings might open other questions. About what the bank knew, and when. About the planning office connections." "Probably," he said. "That's bigger than Tom's account," she said. "It is." She drank her coffee. "I don't know what you spent in that auction room," she said. "I understand you'll get it back when the title paperwork is corrected. But I know what it cost you to be there." She looked at him. "You could have been anywhere. You didn't have any reason to stay." "I had the reason," he said. "I just didn't know it before I stopped for coffee." She smiled, not broadly, not performed, but the real kind that comes when something strikes you as the precise truth told simply. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. The windmill turned. The creek made it sound. "He would have hated needing to be saved," she said, meaning Tom. "He was stubborn that way." She paused. "But I think he would have understood why you did it. Not the money, just the being there." "He left you good evidence," Steve said. "He left me everything he had," she said. "That was just the part that happened to be useful." She stood and went inside. She was gone for perhaps 2 minutes. When she came back, she was carrying something, a hat. A working hat. The kind that ranchers wear when they are actually out on the land and not making an appearance. Brown. shaped by years of use. The brim curved exactly right in the way a hat gets when it has been taken on and off by the same hand thousands of times. This was Tom's, she said. He wore it for every significant thing, every deal he closed, every hard season he got through, every morning he walked out to see if the land was still his. She held it out. Steve looked at it. I can't take that, he said. I know you can't, she said. That's why I'm not giving it to you to keep. I'm giving it to you to put on and take with you while you drive out of here. She paused. And then, you can leave it somewhere on the road, somewhere that feels right. He took the hat. He turned it in his hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular shape, worn into it by years of a man's head and hands and work. He put it on. It fit. Of course it fit. She looked at a minute and then looked away, quickly, at the land, at the horizon, at the creek trees in the distance. Go on, she said, before the day gets loud. He stood. He set his coffee mug on the porch rail. He walked down the steps into his car, and he got in. He did not look back, not because the moment didn't deserve it, but because Evelyn Carter was the kind of woman who had been looked back at as a diminishing thing for 7 months, a figure receding, a loss completing itself, and he was not going to be one more person who turned around to see how small she had become. She was not small. She stood on her porch and watched his car go down the road, the dust rising in the still, morning air, and she did not cry, because there was no grief in this departure, and because she had done all the crying that the land had required of her and was now done. With that season, the car reached the county road and turned south and was gone. The dust settled. The windmill clicked. The creek made its quiet sound. She went inside, and she poured herself another cup of coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the land that was hers, that had always been hers in the clear, Texas light of a morning that was new. Somewhere on the highway south of Caldwell Flats, Steve McQueen drove with the windows down and a dead man's hat on his head, and the road stretched out ahead of him in the way roads do in that country, flat, honest, going somewhere and nowhere at once, offering the particular promise of motion that is sometimes all a man needs. He wore the hat for 30 miles. Then he saw a fence post at the side of the road, out in the open country where nobody was watching, and he pulled over and got out and set the hat carefully on top of the post. He stepped back and looked at it. It sat there in the morning sun the way a good hat does when it is at rest, not abandoned, not lost, but placed, deliberately, with intention. He got back in the car. Caldwell Flats faded into the distance behind him, and with it the town hall and the auction room and the ceiling fan and the gavel, and Walter Boone's careful, rehearsed smile, and Harold Pike standing very still in his too-tight suit, in front of everyone he had intended to impress, while the room quietly decided what kind of people they were going to be. What remained, after all of it, was simpler than the story that contained it. A woman had kept her land. A dead man's payments had finally been counted. A teller who had told the truth and lost his job, for it had finally been heard. And a man who had stopped for coffee on his way through had stayed long enough to do the one thing nobody else in that town had been willing to do, not because he was famous, not because he was rich, but because he had walked into a room full of people watching a decent woman be erased, and he had understood something that everyone else had found complicated reasons to ignore, that sometimes justice doesn't need a hero, it just needs someone who refuses to leave. He drove. The bank would reckon with what it had done. The judge would see the documents. The land would stay where it belonged in the hands of the woman who had earned it. All of that would happen in the slow, necessary, unsatisfying way that justice actually works. But the moment that mattered had already happened. In a room on a Friday morning in Caldwell Flats, Texas, when a quiet man at the back raised his hand once and made 7 months of someone else's cruelty cost exactly what it should have cost from the beginning.